Yep.
They're obviously going all in on the law and order thing, thinking that this is 1968. Again, Lyndon Johnson was president in 1968, and Hubert Humphrey was vice president. So law and order was used against the sitting incumbent vice president when the country was on fire back then. But you look at the poll numbers. We're going to be showing an ABC News poll that just came out a few minutes ago that show that people overwhelmingly, and not only overwhelmingly oppose the president's approach to this, but also overwhelmingly support the protesters. And I guess what baffles me so much is why the president, looking at these numbers, looking at where two-thirds of America is, why the president can't try to be more of a unifier, why he can't try to bring, it's never too late to change. I know it seems impossible for him to do, but again, if two-thirds of Americans are opposing your approach, and generals, just every day, more generals, more military men and women coming out criticizing that approach, why not try a different direction?
Yeah, new ABC poll out just this morning, Joe, shows 32% of Americans support the way the president has handled these protests in the aftermath of the death of George Floyd. And as you said, General John Kelly, the president's former chief of staff now, he's out yesterday confirming General Mattis's version of events, that he, in fact, resigned and was not fired. So you have people, generals, not just from the outside of the military, but also who worked for and beside Donald Trump for a couple of years, coming out and criticizing him in a very public way. And Jonathan Lemire, as you listened to the White House press shop yesterday talking about all options being on the table, they continue to drill down into the idea that they may put military into the streets, that they keep all options on the table, talking again about protesters and demonstrators who are overwhelmingly peaceful. They want to keep the military option on the table for American protesters in the streets.
That's right, Willie. Yesterday was the memorial service for Floyd in Minneapolis, which featured a absolutely gut-wrenching and heartbreaking 8 minutes, 46 seconds of silence, the amount of time that the officer's knee was on Mr. Floyd's neck. The president made not one mention of George Floyd yesterday throughout in his on Twitter or anything else. We didn't have any public events yesterday. We didn't hear from him directly, but he was very active on Twitter. And as you just played, a White House spokesman made it clear that the military option was still on the table. They're still focusing on the unruliness of a small subset of the protesters. They're ignoring the underlying causes to this point. They're certainly not talking about the largely peaceful protesters, but instead fixating on some of the clashes that we're still seeing in American cities. And to Joe's point earlier, this is a White House and a re-election campaign that is absolutely leaning into this law and order narrative, that the president is the tough candidate here. He's going to show strength, and it's Donald Trump's perception of strength and might, because he's using American forces and federal law enforcement on American citizens, but they believe that can still work. That new poll that I know we're going to talk about suggests that American people does not necessarily agree. Certainly there was concerns with the building about some of the optics about how Monday night went down. The president has complained bitterly to aides about the media coverage that he has received for the way Lafayette Park was cleared and the way he held that Bible in front of the church. But in terms of an overall narrative, this is still something they want, and they feel like it's a contrast that they can win with some of the Democratic mayors and governors who are seeing these protests happen in their streets. But it also goes to show, as a final point, it's a president without much of a playbook right now. They're flailing and grasping to try to change the subject here from this week, and how the president, in his mind, he fears that he looks afraid, cowardly, behind a heavily fortified White House and not being able to engage these protesters in any meaningful way.
But this week has been an absolute disaster, and there are other ways to approach these protesters instead of confrontation. And I know I'm speaking, I know this is obvious, but any White House aide that believes that only having 32% of Americans support your approach to one of the great crises of our time, need to leave the White House because the president's not being served well there. You could say the same thing about the pandemic. The president's numbers in this ABC News are extraordinarily low when it comes to the pandemic. There's no getting around the fact that those are two of the biggest crises this country has faced since you take your pick, 1968, World War II. And Americans are opposed to the way he handled both of those crises, and it's going to require a new start.